You should have asked who she was before you touched her." The words weren't loud, but somehow they cut through the soft violin music drifting across the restaurant like cold steel sliding across glass. Every fork stopped moving. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of wealthy diners dressed in black suits and silk dresses, their conversations fading into uneasy silence as heads slowly turned toward table 14 near the center of the room. Vanessa Cole sat perfectly still in her chair, one hand resting lightly beside her wine glass, the faint red outline on her cheek glowing beneath the warm amber candlelight. Across from her, Damien Moretti calmly folded his dark linen napkin beside an untouched filet mignon, his expression unreadable, almost detached, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But the room could feel it. Something heavy had entered the air. 30 seconds earlier, laughter had filled the restaurant. The private dining hall at Bella Vita on West 52nd Street was one of Manhattan's hardest reservations to get, a place where senators, athletes, and old money families disappeared behind velvet curtains and $100 bottles of wine. Vanessa had almost canceled the dinner altogether. She hated places like this. Too quiet, too polished, too many eyes that silently judged before a single word was spoken. But tonight mattered. It was her wedding anniversary. 11 years. Damien had insisted they celebrate somewhere special. So she wore the black satin dress he bought her in Soho last month and the silver earrings that once belonged to her mother. She wanted the night to feel normal, peaceful. For the first hour, it almost was. The candle between them flickered softly while rain tapped against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan traffic below. Vanessa laughed quietly as Damien complained about a terrible espresso he'd had earlier in Brooklyn. He rarely joked in public, which made moments like this feel rare and fragile, like something she wanted to hold on to for as long as possible. Then Chloe Whitman arrived at their table. Blonde ponytail, sharp lipstick, white uniform pressed so perfectly it looked untouched by human hands. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from believing certain people belonged in certain places. At first, it was little things. A dismissive glance, a delayed response, the way she spoke to Damien politely but addressed Vanessa like she barely existed. Vanessa noticed it immediately. She always did. Years of surviving rooms where people underestimated her had sharpened that instinct into something almost painful. Still, she ignored it. She smiled politely, kept her voice soft, tried not to ruin the night. But when Chloe returned with a bottle of wine for the neighboring VIP table, everything changed in seconds. One accidental bump, a splash of deep red across expensive fabric. Gasps rose around the room. Vanessa stood quickly, apologizing even before she fully understood what happened. "I'm so sorry," she said instinctively, reaching for a napkin. But Chloe's face twisted instantly with anger. Not embarrassment, not frustration, something uglier. "Do you people ever watch where you're going?" She snapped loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Conversation stopped. Vanessa froze. The words hit harder than the wine itself. Damien slowly looked up from his glass. His dark eyes locked onto the waitress, silent and impossible to read. Vanessa gently touched his wrist beneath the table. A warning. "Please don't." But Chloe wasn't finished. "Honestly," she muttered, shaking her head while staring directly at Vanessa's dress. "They let anybody into VIP these days." A few nervous chuckles spread through the room. Someone near the bar pulled out a phone. Vanessa felt heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her composure. "There's no need to be disrespectful," she said quietly. Chloe stepped closer. "Then maybe act like you belong here." And then, with one careless motion meant more to humiliate than harm, Chloe shoved the stained napkin against Vanessa's shoulder hard enough to make the room collectively inhale. Silence crashed over the restaurant. The violinist stopped mid-note. Somewhere near the kitchen, a wineglass shattered. But Damien Moretti still hadn't moved. The silence inside Bella Vita stretched so long it no longer felt like silence at all. It felt like pressure, heavy, suffocating, the kind that made people suddenly remember unfinished business and urgent places they needed to be. Chloe Whitman noticed it too. Her confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly as she glanced around the dining room expecting support, laughter, something to reassure her she still controlled the moment. But nobody was laughing anymore. Even the waiter carrying a tray of champagne near the bar had stopped walking. Vanessa slowly lowered the stained napkin from her shoulder and placed it carefully beside her plate. Her fingers trembled slightly, though her face remained calm. She hated scenes. Always had. Growing up in East Flatbush taught her one important rule early in life. Public humiliation only fed cruel people. The less reaction you gave them, the faster they moved on to someone else. So she inhaled quietly and reached for her purse. "Damien," she whispered softly, not even looking at him. "Let us just leave." But Damien Moretti still had not touched his glass, had not blinked, had not looked away from Chloe once. The candlelight flickered across the sharp edges of his face, catching the silver strands beginning to appear near his temples. To strangers, he looked almost ordinary tonight. A man in his late 40s wearing a simple black dress shirt beneath a charcoal coat. No jewelry except a matte black wedding band. No bodyguards standing nearby. No visible signs of wealth beyond the watch resting beneath his cuff. Understated and impossibly expensive. Yet something about him unsettled the room in ways nobody could explain. Chloe crossed her arms defensively. "If you are done causing problems," she said, trying to recover her confidence, "I can have someone escort you out." Damien finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. He lifted his linen napkin from the table and folded it once with perfect precision before setting it beside his untouched plate. The tiny sound of fabric brushing polished would seem unnaturally loud in the silence. Then he looked at Vanessa first, not Chloe. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Vanessa shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice came out softer than intended. Damien nodded once. "Just once." Then he turned toward Chloe. "What is your name?" The question landed strangely. Too calm. Too controlled. Chloe forced out a small laugh. "Excuse me. Your name?" Damien repeated. "I would like to know who is speaking to my wife this way." Several people nearby exchanged uneasy glances. One older man seated near the back slowly lowered his wine glass after hearing the word wife. He stared harder at Damien now, his face beginning to pale beneath the dim restaurant lights. Chloe rolled her eyes. "My name is none of your business." Damien tilted his head slightly, as though considering her answer. "That would have been the correct response," he said softly, "about 30 seconds ago." Vanessa immediately touched his wrist beneath the table again. This time her fingers tightened. "Please," she whispered. "Not here." Damien looked down at her hand resting against his sleeve. The tension in his jaw shifted for the first time all evening. Not anger. Pain. The kind carried by someone who spent years learning how to bury dangerous instincts beneath restraint. Across the dining room, the manager finally rushed forward, his polished shoes squeaking slightly against the marble floor. "Sir," he said nervously while forcing a smile, "I am sure this entire situation is simply a misunderstanding." Damien looked at him without expression. The manager stopped mid-sentence. Something behind Damien's eyes made his rehearsed hospitality collapse instantly. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier. This was colder. Controlled. Like watching someone calculate exactly how much damage they were willing to tolerate before everything changed. Rain hammered harder against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan now, streaking silver lines across the glass. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city. Then every phone inside the restaurant buzzed at once. Not one or two. All of them. A strange ripple moved across the room as businessmen, socialites, and politicians glanced down at their screens simultaneously. The older man near the back looked first. His face drained completely of color. Without finishing his drink, he stood so abruptly his chair nearly tipped. Backward. "We need to leave," he muttered urgently to the woman beside him. Another guest near the bar whispered something under his breath after checking his phone, and suddenly his expression changed from curiosity to fear. Chloe noticed it immediately. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice no longer steady. Nobody answered her. Because one by one, people throughout Bella Vita had finally started recognizing the man sitting across from Vanessa Cole. Recognition spread through Bella Vita like a slow electrical fire crawling beneath the floorboards. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. The older man who had nearly knocked over his chair, while leaving, kept glancing back toward Damien Moretti with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing too close to a live grenade. Nearby diners lowered their voices to whispers sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz, returning faintly through the restaurant speakers. Chloe Whitman stood frozen beside the table now, her earlier confidence cracking around the edges. She could feel it happening even if she did not yet understand why. The manager understood first. His name was Richard Ellis, and for 12 years he had built Bella Vita into one of Manhattan's most exclusive dining rooms by mastering one simple skill. He knew exactly who held power the moment they walked through the door. Politicians, hedge fund executives, judges, old families whose names were carved into libraries and hospital wings across New York City. Richard remembered every face, every reputation, every rumor whispered over expensive whiskey after midnight. And now, staring at the quiet man seated beside Vanessa Cole, Richard felt his stomach sink like stone into cold water. Because Damien Moretti was not supposed to exist in places like this. Men like him did not appear publicly. They appeared in stories. In rumors passed between nervous business owners and frightened officials who suddenly changed their minds about investigations. Richard had seen one photograph of him years ago during a private fundraising dinner in Manhattan. Same eyes, same stillness. The kind of stillness that did not come from calmness, but from complete control. Richard swallowed hard and quickly approached the table again, forcing a smile that looked painful now. "Mr. Moretti," he said carefully, "if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, I assure you we can resolve this immediately." Chloe slowly turned toward him. "Wait," she said quietly, "you know him?" Richard ignored her completely. Damien finally leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm resting beside his untouched wine glass. "Do I?" he asked softly. Richard's face tightened. Tiny beads of sweat formed near his temples despite the cool air flowing through the dining room. Vanessa noticed it immediately. She hated this part. The shift. The moment people stopped seeing Damien as a man and started seeing him as a threat. It happened everywhere eventually. Grocery stores, charity events, school meetings years ago before they stopped trying to live ordinary lives. At first people liked him, respected him even, until somebody recognized the name. Then the atmosphere changed instantly. Smiles disappeared. Conversations shortened. Fear entered the room like smoke beneath a locked door. Vanessa reached for her purse again. "Damien," she whispered gently, "please, let us just go home." Her voice carried exhaustion now instead of embarrassment. Damien looked at her carefully. The hard edges in his expression softened for barely a second. 11 years together, and she was still the only person alive capable of pulling him back from dangerous places without raising her voice. But before he could answer, Chloe laughed nervously. Not because anything was funny, because panic had begun slipping into her chest, and she did not know what else to do with it. "This is insane," she muttered while folding her arms tighter. "Everybody is acting like he is some kind of celebrity." Nobody responded. That silence frightened her more than shouting ever could have. One of the bartenders quietly stepped backward toward the kitchen without taking his eyes off Damien. Near the entrance, two wealthy men abruptly ended their dinner and walked out without waiting for the check. Richard noticed and nearly closed his eyes in despair. Bella Vita was bleeding status by the second. Then Chloe made the mistake that changed everything. She looked directly at Vanessa and said, "I do not care who your husband is. You still do not belong here." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately, not out of shame, out of disappointment. Deep, tired disappointment. Damien watched his wife carefully, watched the way her shoulders stiffened beneath the candlelight, watched her fingers tighten around the strap of her purse. And for the first time that evening, something inside him shifted visibly. Not anger. Worse. Decision. He slowly stood from the table. No sudden movement. No raised voice. Just 6 feet 3 inches of quiet authority rising beneath the golden restaurant lights while thunder rolled beyond the rain-covered windows of Manhattan. The entire room stopped breathing. Damien adjusted the cuff of his black sleeve calmly, then looked directly at Chloe Whitman with eyes colder than the storm outside. "You are right," he said softly. "My wife does not belong in places like this anymore." Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but the restaurant doors suddenly swung open before she could speak. The moment the restaurant doors opened, cold rain air swept through Bella Vita and carried silence with it. Every head turned instinctively toward the entrance. For men stepped inside wearing dark overcoats damp from the storm outside, their movements calm and perfectly coordinated without appearing rehearsed. They were not loud. They were not threatening. Yet the entire energy of the room shifted the second they entered. One of them quietly removed his gloves near the doorway while another scanned the dining room once before stopping immediately when his eyes landed on Damien Moretti standing beside table 14. None of them spoke. They simply nodded once. Respectfully, like soldiers acknowledging a commander. Chloe Whitman stared at them in confusion. "Who are these people?" she whispered, though nobody answered her. Richard Ellis looked seconds away from collapse. He recognized two of the men instantly. Not by name, by reputation. Men connected to shipping unions, private security contracts, and businesses nobody asked too many questions about if they valued peaceful lives. Richard suddenly understood why every phone in the restaurant had buzzed moments earlier. Word had spread faster than lightning across Manhattan that Damien Moretti was standing inside Bella Vita, and something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Vanessa exhaled slowly and closed her eyes for half a second. This was exactly what she feared. Not revenge. Attention. Attention always made everything worse around Damien. She still remembered the first time she truly understood who he was. 11 years ago in Brooklyn, long before the penthouse apartment and private drivers and endless charity galas. Back then he had simply been a quiet man who brought groceries to elderly neighbors during snowstorms and slipped cash beneath the doors of struggling families without ever admitting it was him. She fell in love with that version first. The gentle version. The man who listened more than he spoke. The man who sat beside her mother's hospital bed for 8 straight hours when she was too exhausted to stay awake. But eventually she saw the other side too. The side powerful men feared. The side politicians respected a little too carefully. The side capable of changing entire rooms without raising his voice above a whisper. And standing inside Bella Vita tonight, Vanessa could feel that version of him getting closer to the surface with every passing second. Damien glanced briefly toward the men who had entered before returning his attention to Vanessa. "You should go to the car," he said softly. Vanessa immediately shook her head. "No, Vanessa." I said no. Her voice stayed quiet, but there was steel beneath it now. Damien studied her face carefully. The rain outside streaked silver across the windows behind them, while candlelight flickered across the faint mark still visible on her cheek. Something painful passed through his eyes. Not embarrassment. Regret. Because none of this should have happened tonight. Not to her. Especially not to her. Across the room, Chloe tried desperately to recover control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped while forcing a nervous laugh. All of this because somebody got offended. One of the men near the entrance slowly looked toward her after hearing that sentence. The expression on his face did not change at all, which somehow made it worse. Richard rushed toward Chloe immediately. "Enough," he hissed under his breath. "Stop talking." Chloe jerked her arm away from him. Why is everybody acting terrified of this guy? Richard stared at her like he could not believe she still did not understand. Then his phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence so sharply that several guests flinched. Richard glanced down at the screen and nearly stopped breathing. He answered immediately with trembling hands. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. A long pause followed while he listened. His face lost what little color remained. "I understand." Another pause. "No, sir. Absolutely not." He lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. The restaurant had become so quiet that the soft rain against the windows sounded deafening. Damien did not ask who called. He already knew. Richard swallowed hard before looking directly at Chloe. "You need to apologize," he whispered. Chloe blinked in disbelief. "What? Now? For what?" Richard stared at her for several painful seconds before answering. "Because the owner of this building is on that phone." Chloe frowned. "So?" Richard's voice cracked slightly. "And he just asked me why someone in his restaurant humiliated Mrs. Moretti." The words landed like thunder across Bella Vita. Mrs. Moretti. Not guest. Not customer. Family. Suddenly, the expensive dining room no longer felt like neutral territory. It felt owned. Every chandelier. Every marble floor tile. Every polished wine glass reflecting golden candlelight. Chloe slowly looked back toward Vanessa, and for the first time all night, fear finally appeared in her eyes. Fear changed the atmosphere inside Bella Vita faster than anger ever could. Moments ago, the restaurant had been filled with polished laughter, clinking wine glasses, and quiet conversations between wealthy strangers pretending not to stare. Now nobody seemed willing to move at all. Chloe Whitman stood near table 14 with her arms hanging stiffly at her sides, the color slowly draining from her face as realization settled heavier into her chest with every passing second. She looked toward Vanessa again, but this time she did not see an ordinary woman sitting quietly beneath candlelight. She saw someone protected, someone important, and suddenly every careless word she had spoken replayed in her mind with terrifying clarity. Vanessa noticed the change immediately. She had seen it happen before too many times. The exact moment confidence collapsed into regret. Usually it came after people discovered Damien's last name. But the thing they never understood was that Damien himself rarely frightened her. It was what fear did to everyone else around him. Fear made people reckless, desperate, sometimes cruel. Vanessa slowly stood from her chair and adjusted the sleeve of her black satin dress, where the wine stain had begun drying against the fabric. Her anniversary dinner was ruined now. She knew that much. The soft candlelight no longer felt warm. The music sounded distant and strained. Even the rain against the windows carried tension now instead of comfort. Damien turned toward her immediately. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "let me take you home." She looked up at him carefully. Despite the silence surrounding him, despite the power radiating through the room like invisible electricity, she still saw the same man who once sat beside her in a tiny laundromat in Brooklyn at 2 in the morning because her apartment building lost power during winter. The same man who warmed her freezing hands with his coffee cup while pretending he was not cold himself. That man still existed beneath all this darkness. She reached gently for his hand. "I do not want this to become something ugly," she whispered. Damien looked down at her fingers wrapped around his. For a moment his expression softened enough for only her to notice. "Neither do I." But across the room, panic had already started spreading. Several guests quietly slipped toward the exits while pretending not to stare. One woman, near the bar, whispered nervously into her phone before quickly lowering her voice the second Damien glanced in her direction. Richard Ellis stood frozen beside the hostess station, wiping sweat from his forehead with trembling fingers while trying to think several moves ahead at once. The owner of Bella Vita had personally called him less than 2 minutes ago, not to ask questions, to issue instructions. "Fix this immediately. No police. No publicity. No mistakes." Richard understood exactly what that meant. Bella Vita survived because powerful people felt safe there. Tonight, that illusion had shattered completely. Chloe finally found her voice again, though it sounded much smaller now. "I did not know," she said quietly. Nobody answered. The silence after her sentence felt almost unbearable. Chloe swallowed hard and looked directly at Vanessa. "I did not know who you were." Vanessa's eyes saddened instantly, not because of the apology, because of what it revealed. She stepped slowly away from the table, heels soft against the marble floor, and stopped directly in front of Chloe. "That is the problem," Vanessa said gently. Her voice never rose. "You should not need to know who someone is before treating them with dignity." Chloe lowered her eyes immediately. The words hit harder than humiliation ever could. Around them, the entire restaurant remained frozen in place listening. Even Damien said nothing. Vanessa continued softly. "If I had been nobody tonight, would this still matter to you?" Chloe opened her mouth, but no answer came out, because they both already knew the truth. Rainwater slid down the tall windows behind them in silver streaks, while distant thunder rolled across Manhattan. One of the men near the entrance quietly looked away, almost uncomfortable witnessing the conversation now. Damien watched his wife carefully. Pride flickered behind the coldness in his eyes. Not because she stood up for herself, because even after being humiliated publicly, she still chose grace instead of cruelty. That was the part of Vanessa the world never understood. She could have weaponized Damien's power years ago if she wanted. She never once did. Chloe's eyes filled slowly with tears she clearly did not expect. "I am sorry," she whispered finally. "I really am." Vanessa studied her face for several long seconds. Fear was there. Shame too. But, beneath both, she saw something else beginning to surface. Understanding. Real understanding. Damien stepped closer then, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. The entire restaurant tensed instantly again. But instead of looking at Chloe, he looked at Vanessa. "Tell me what you want me to do," he said quietly. And somehow, that frightened the room more than anything else all night. The question hung over Bella Vita heavier than the storm outside. "Tell me what you want me to do." Nobody in the restaurant misunderstood what Damien Moretti meant. That was what terrified them. Power did not always arrive with shouting or threats. Sometimes it arrived quietly in a black dress shirt beneath soft candlelight. asking one calm question while an entire room waited for the answer. Vanessa looked at her husband for several long seconds without speaking. Around them, crystal glasses reflected gold across the marble tables, while rain rolled steadily down the tall windows, facing Manhattan traffic below. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cook dropped a metal pan and immediately apologized in a whisper even though nobody had yelled. The entire building felt fragile now, balanced on the edge of something nobody wanted to witness. Vanessa slowly released Damien's hand and looked toward Chloe again. The young waitress no longer appeared arrogant. She looked small, lost. Her mascara had begun smudging beneath frightened eyes she kept trying not to lower. Vanessa recognized that expression too. Shame had a way of stripping people down to the version of themselves they usually hid from the world. Richard Ellis stood nearby, barely breathing, terrified of saying the wrong thing while watching years of carefully built reputation collapse in real time. Vanessa glanced around the dining room one more time. Wealthy strangers sat frozen beside half-finished meals, pretending not to stare while staring at everything. Some looked frightened. Others looked fascinated. A few looked guilty, especially the ones who laughed earlier when Chloe humiliated her. That part stayed with Vanessa most. Not the insult. Not the wine stain drying against her dress. The laughter. How easy it was for people to join cruelty when they believed there would be no consequences for it. Damien noticed the distant look in her eyes immediately. "Vanessa," he said softly. She turned toward him again. His face remained calm, but she knew him well enough to see the tension buried beneath it. The restraint. Damien had spent years learning how to control what fear and anger could turn him into. For her. Only for her. She remembered nights waking beside him after nightmares he never explained. Remembered the way his jaw tightened any time somebody raised their voice at her in public. Damien could survive disrespect aimed at himself all day without reacting. But Vanessa was different. Always different. She stepped closer and gently adjusted the collar of his coat beneath the warm restaurant lights. Such a small gesture, yet it somehow softened the entire room for one brief second. "I want to go home," she whispered. Damien looked at her carefully. "That is all." Vanessa nodded slowly. "I do not want anyone destroyed over one terrible moment." Chloe's face crumpled slightly after hearing those words. She looked down immediately, unable to meet Vanessa's eyes anymore. Damien exhaled through his nose and glanced briefly toward the men waiting near the entrance. One subtle nod. Nothing more. The men relaxed instantly. Not disappointed. Relieved. Richard Ellis nearly sagged with visible exhaustion. Vanessa noticed that too. Fear had wrapped itself around everyone inside Bella Vita tonight. Fear of power. Fear of consequences. Fear of what might happen if the wrong choice was made. And suddenly she felt tired. Deeply tired. "People think fear changes hearts," Vanessa said quietly, looking toward Chloe again. "It does not. Fear only teaches people to hide what they already are." Nobody interrupted her. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Chloe slowly wiped beneath her eyes with shaking fingers. "I am sorry," she whispered again, this time sounding less afraid and more ashamed. Vanessa believed her. That was the strange part. She believed the apology now because Chloe was no longer defending herself. She was finally listening. Damien watched the exchange silently before, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. The entire restaurant visibly tensed again. But instead of pulling out anything threatening, he simply removed a folded white handkerchief and handed it gently to Vanessa. She smiled faintly before using it to blot the wine stain near her sleeve. Such an ordinary gesture. Husband and wife. Quiet. Human. The tension inside Bella Vita shifted almost painfully after that. Because for the first time all night, people stopped seeing Damien Moretti as a legend whispered about in dark corners of Manhattan. They saw a man standing beside the woman he loved while trying very hard not to become something dangerous for her sake. Vanessa folded the handkerchief carefully and then surprised everyone in the room by stepping toward Chloe and placing it softly into her trembling hands. Chloe looked stunned. "Keep it," Vanessa said gently. "Maybe next time you will remember this night before deciding someone does not belong." Chloe stared down at the white cloth resting in her palms as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. And for the first time since the nightmare began, nobody in Bella Vita looked afraid of Damien Moretti anymore. They looked ashamed of themselves. For several seconds after Vanessa handed Chloe the white handkerchief, nobody inside Bella Vita moved at all. The storm outside continued washing silver rain across the tall windows while candle flames trembled softly beneath the air conditioning vents overhead. Yet the tension that had gripped the restaurant all evening no longer felt sharp and dangerous. It felt heavy instead, reflective, like an entire room had just been forced to look directly at itself and did not like what it saw. Chloe stared down at the folded cloth resting in her trembling hands as mascara streaked faintly beneath her eyes. Earlier that night, she had believed she understood power. She thought power was deciding who deserved respect and who did not. She thought it lived in expensive dining rooms, polished appearances, and the approval of wealthy strangers. But standing there now beneath the golden restaurant lights, she realized the most powerful person in the room had been the woman who chose mercy. When humiliation would have been easier. Vanessa stepped quietly back toward Damien and reached for her coat draped across the chair. The faint wine stain still darkened the sleeve of her black dress, but she no longer seemed embarrassed by it. The stain had become something else now. A reminder. Around them, guests slowly lowered their eyes, suddenly unable to hold the confident expressions they wore earlier. One woman near the bar looked visibly ashamed after realizing Vanessa had caught her laughing before. Another man quietly slipped a folded $100 bill beneath his untouched dessert plate and left without waiting for change. Nobody wanted to remain part of the ugliness hanging in the air anymore. Damien helped Vanessa into her coat with gentle hands that looked almost out of place against the darkness surrounding his reputation. Richard Ellis noticed that detail too. The care, the patience. He had expected intimidation tonight. Anger perhaps. Instead, the most frightening thing about Damien Moretti turned out to be how deeply he loved his wife. Because everyone in Bella Vita understood the same terrifying truth now. If Vanessa had wanted revenge, nobody in the room believed Damien would have denied her anything. But she did not ask for revenge. She asked to go home. Richard stepped forward carefully while adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. "Mrs. Moretti," he said quietly, "there are no words sufficient for tonight." Vanessa looked at him kindly, but with visible exhaustion. "Then do not waste time searching for them," she replied softly. Richard lowered his eyes immediately. The answer carried no cruelty. Only truth. Damien rested one hand lightly against the middle of Vanessa's back as they turned toward the entrance. The men waiting near the doorway stepped aside instantly without being asked. Outside, black umbrellas waited beneath the rain beside a long dark sedan parked along the curb. Bella Vita had fallen completely silent again. Even the musicians near the back corner sat motionless beside their instruments, unsure whether playing music now would somehow feel disrespectful. Then Chloe spoke unexpectedly. "Mrs. Moretti?" Vanessa paused near the entrance, but did not turn around immediately. Chloe clutched the white handkerchief tightly between shaking fingers before finally forcing herself to continue. "You asked me earlier if I would have cared if you were nobody." Her voice cracked slightly. "The answer is no." Several people nearby looked uncomfortable hearing the honesty spoken out loud. Chloe swallowed hard and wiped beneath her eyes again. "That is what scares me now." Slowly, Vanessa turned back toward her. Chloe looked younger somehow standing there beneath the restaurant lights. Smaller, like the arrogance she carried earlier had finally collapsed under the weight of self-awareness. Vanessa studied her quietly for several seconds before speaking. "The fact that it scares you means you still have time to become better." Chloe's lips parted slightly as fresh tears filled her eyes. Nobody in Bella Vita would forget those words. Not because they sounded dramatic. Because they sounded sincere. Damien watched Vanessa carefully beside him, and for the first time all night, a faint softness touched the corners of his expression. Pride. Pure and unmistakable. Not in her composure. Not in her beauty. In her heart. Vanessa reached gently for his hand again. "Let us go home," she whispered. This time Damien nodded immediately. Together they walked toward the rain-covered entrance while every eye in the restaurant followed them in silence. No applause. No dramatic final words. Just the quiet sound of polished shoes against marble floors and rain tapping softly against Manhattan glass. But as Damien opened the restaurant door for his wife, Richard Ellis suddenly realized something unsettling. Bella Vita would recover from the scandal eventually. The wealthy guests would return. The headlines would never appear because men like Damien Moretti ensured certain stories disappeared before reaching newspapers. But nobody inside that restaurant would ever forget the moment a woman they underestimated showed them the difference between power and dignity. Rain fell steadily over Manhattan as Damien opened the black umbrella above Vanessa and guided her carefully down the restaurant steps toward the waiting sedan. The city lights blurred across the wet pavement in streaks of gold and white, while passing traffic hissed softly through puddles along West 52nd Street. Behind them, Bella Vita's glowing windows reflected faintly against the storm like a memory already beginning to fade. But neither of them climbed into the car immediately. Vanessa paused beside the curb, her black heels inches from the rainwater flowing toward the gutter, and stared quietly across the street where neon signs flickered against old brick buildings. Damien stood beside her without speaking. One hand held the umbrella steady while the other rested gently against the middle of her back, protective without appearing possessive. He could feel the exhaustion in her posture now. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional. The kind that settled deep into the bones after being reminded how quickly people decided who deserved kindness and who did not. For several moments, they simply listened to the rain. It drummed softly against the umbrella fabric overhead, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. The city kept moving around them, unaware that inside one restaurant a room full of powerful people had just been forced to confront themselves. Damien finally broke the silence first. I should have stopped it sooner. Vanessa looked up at him immediately. No, Vanessa. No. She repeated more firmly this time. You stayed calm for me. Damien lowered his eyes briefly. That was true. Every instinct inside him had screamed to respond the moment Chloe humiliated her publicly. But Vanessa hated what fear did to rooms. Hated what happened when people saw Damien as something dangerous instead of human. So he held himself back. For her. Always for her. Vanessa studied his face beneath the glow of the streetlights. Most people only noticed Damien's reputation first. The whispers. The rumors. The stories wealthy men exchanged in private clubs when they thought nobody important was listening. But she noticed smaller things instead. The tiny crease beside his left eye that deepened whenever he worried about her. The way he loosened his cufflinks after stressful evenings because tension settled in his hands first. The fact that after 11 years together, he still opened every car door for her like it mattered. You know what hurt the most tonight? She asked quietly. Damien looked at her immediately. Vanessa glanced back toward the restaurant windows glowing behind them. It was not Chloe. Rain tapped softly against the umbrella between them. It was how many people laughed because they thought I was powerless. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger this time. Sadness. Because he knew she was right. People often revealed who they truly were when they believed someone could not fight back. Vanessa folded her arms against the cold breeze drifting through the street and exhaled slowly. If they knew who I was from the beginning, she whispered, none of it would have happened. Maybe. No, she said softly. Definitely. Damien looked toward the rain-covered skyline in silence. The city shimmered endlessly beyond them, millions of lights glowing through the storm like scattered stars. He had spent most of his life understanding power, building it, surviving because of it. But Vanessa understood something different, something rarer. She understood dignity without needing fear attached to it. The back door of Bella Vita suddenly opened behind them. Richard Ellis stepped outside cautiously beneath the restaurant awning while clutching a folded navy coat over one arm. He looked uncertain approaching them now that the tension inside had finally broken. Mrs. Moretti, he called carefully over the rain. Vanessa turned toward him. Richard walked down the steps slowly and offered the coat with both hands. One of our guests left this for you, he explained. She said your dress should not be ruined because of tonight. Vanessa looked surprised. Who? Richard shook his head gently. She did not leave her name. Vanessa accepted the coat carefully. It was expensive. Cashmere. Still warm from the restaurant. She looked back toward the glowing windows again and noticed several people quietly watching from inside. Not with fear anymore. Something closer to reflection. Damien noticed it too. Richard hesitated awkwardly before speaking again. Mrs. Moretti, he said quietly, I have managed restaurants for a long time. I have seen powerful people destroy lives over much smaller things than this. He swallowed hard. What you did tonight, most people would not have shown that kind of mercy. Vanessa held the folded coat gently against her arms while rainwater shimmered across the sidewalk around them. Mercy is easy when someone finally understands they were wrong, she replied softly. Richard lowered his eyes for a second, visibly moved by the answer. Damien opened the car door then and held it for her beneath the rain. Vanessa paused one last time before getting inside and looked back toward Bella Vita's glowing entrance. Somewhere behind those windows, Chloe Whitman was probably still standing there holding a white handkerchief and replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. Vanessa hoped she remembered the lesson longer than the fear. Then she slid quietly into the car, while Manhattan rain continued falling around them like the city itself was trying to wash something clean. The black sedan moved quietly through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, while city lights slid across the windows in blurred streaks of gold, red, and silver. Inside the car, silence settled softly between Damien and Vanessa, but unlike the silence inside Bella Vita earlier that night, this one felt warm. Safe. The driver kept his eyes forward while jazz played faintly through the speakers at almost no volume, blending with the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the roof above them. Vanessa sat near the window with the borrowed navy coat folded neatly across her lap, her fingers tracing absent circles over the soft cashmere fabric while she watched strangers hurry beneath umbrellas along crowded sidewalks. New York never stopped moving. Not for storms. Not for fear. Not even for moments that changed people forever. Damien loosened the collar of his black shirt slightly and leaned back against the leather seat, exhaustion finally beginning to show beneath his calm expression. Vanessa noticed immediately. She always noticed. "You are quiet," she said softly. Damien let out the faintest breath of amusement. "After tonight, that is your observation?" A small smile touched Vanessa's lips for the first time all evening. It faded quickly, but Damien saw it. And somehow that mattered more to him than the fear he inspired in an entire restaurant full of powerful people. Outside, thunder rolled far above the skyline, while reflections from skyscrapers shimmered across wet pavement below. Vanessa rested her head lightly against the cool window glass. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked quietly after a long silence. Damien turned toward her. "Tired of what?" She looked down at her hands. "People changing the second they learn your name." Damien studied her carefully before answering. "I stopped expecting honesty from strangers a long time ago." Vanessa nodded slowly, though sadness still lingered in her eyes. "I think tonight bothered me because for a moment, I forgot." Damien's expression softened instantly. "Forgot what?" Vanessa looked back out at the rain. "How quickly people decide your worth when they think nobody important will defend you." The car grew quiet again after that. Damien glanced toward the city passing outside, while memories flickered through his mind. He remembered the tiny apartment where Vanessa first told him she loved him even after hearing every ugly rumor about his life. He remembered warning her to walk away before things became complicated. Dangerous. But she stayed anyway. Not because she feared him, because she saw him clearly. The man beneath everything else. "You know what scares people about you?" Vanessa asked suddenly. Damien raised an eyebrow slightly. "I could make a list." This time her smile lasted a little longer. "It is not your power." Damien looked at her curiously. Vanessa turned fully toward him now, candlelight from passing storefronts flickering softly across her face through the rain-covered windows. "It is the fact that you still listen to me despite having enough power to never listen to anyone." Damien stared at her quietly for several seconds before lowering his eyes. Outside, the city lights reflected against the black hood of the sedan as they crossed Park Avenue beneath rows of glowing buildings disappearing into fog and rain. "That is because you are the only person who reminds me who I wanted to be before the world taught me otherwise," he said softly. Vanessa's eyes filled slightly after hearing that. Not with sadness. Something gentler. The kind of emotion built over years of surviving life together instead of merely loving each other through easy moments. The sedan finally slowed in front of their building overlooking the East River, where soft white lights glowed beneath the covered entrance, while rainwater streamed down polished stone steps. One of the doormen hurried forward with an umbrella the second he recognized the car, but Damien shook his head lightly before stepping out himself. He walked around the vehicle and opened Vanessa's door personally despite the rain soaking instantly into his dark coat. Vanessa took his hand as she stepped onto the sidewalk. For a moment, they simply stood there together beneath the storm while the city hummed endlessly around them. No bodyguards. No fear. No expensive restaurant filled with strangers deciding who belonged. Just two people holding on to each other beneath Manhattan rain. Vanessa glanced up at him one last time before they walked inside. You know, she said softly, that waitress probably thinks tonight was about power. Damien brushed a damp strand of hair gently away from her face. And what was it really about? Vanessa looked toward the rain falling beyond the glowing entrance lights. Choice. Damien frowned slightly. Vanessa squeezed his hand gently. She had the choice to humiliate someone she thought was weak, she whispered. And I had the choice not to become cruel after learning I was not. Damien stared at her quietly as the storm rolled across the city behind them. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Because deep down he understood something now that Bellavita never would. Vanessa Cole had not changed the room that night through fear or power or status. She changed it because even after being humiliated publicly, she refused to let bitterness become the loudest voice in the room. And somewhere across Manhattan, inside a restaurant still heavy with shame and silence, people who once laughed at her were probably still thinking about the woman who walked away with dignity while everyone else sat trapped with themselves.